and thank you for joining this session of the Association of State Floodplain Managers Annual Conference. This is C7, Building Resilience into Recovery. We have a great set of presentations for you and want to thank you for joining us to close out your day. We're going to hear from Del Schwalls, from Bill Smith, and from Dan Fricke, as well as his co-presenter, John Callan, shortly. So I'll provide some brief introductions, but first, my name is Matt Little. I work for Guidehouse. I'm an associate director there, where I support federal clients like FEMA on a host of resilience issues. Really excited to be with you, as these are some of the most exciting presentations of the session, in my opinion. First, we're going to hear from Del Schwalls, and a quick little bit about Del. He's the president of Schwalls Consulting, with more than 20 years of experience in floodplain management, hydrologic and hydraulic analysis, and water resource engineering. He specializes in working with communities throughout Florida to achieve their floodplain management goals, including refining their community rating system program and regulatory framework. He conducts trainings across Florida and the country on accurately completing FEMA flood elevation certificates and addressing elevation certificate deficiencies. He also has extensive experience with the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants programs and serves as the SME in HMA grants and FEMA benefit cost analysis for states and communities. Del's presentation is called Mexico Beach, a Hurricane Michael story of a small beach community on the never forgotten coast. Let's roll to the video.
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be talking about the impact of Hurricane Michael on the city of Mexico Beach. And I'm going to be doing so through the eyes of those who experienced it, myself included. See, I've got family who lived in Mexico Beach before Hurricane Michael. And my parents and my brother bought a place back in 2015 in Mexico Beach. And so a lot of the pictures you're going to see and the stories you're going to hear are from my own family. But most of them are from people I've never even met. When I first thought of doing this presentation, it was at last year's Florida Floodplain Managers Association conference. And I reached out to a group on Facebook comprised of residents who were rebuilding in Mexico Beach. And I said, hey, I'm doing a conference presentation. I'm looking for pictures. And the response was overwhelming. Person after person reached out to me and said, tell my story. Tell my story. So today I'm going to walk through a Hurricane Michael story through their eyes, a little small beach community on what is often called the Forgotten Coast. And if I could ask you to take away at least one thing from this presentation, it's to not forget Mexico Beach. Ironically, the year after Hurricane Michael, we started getting very violent hurricanes, and everywhere we looked on the news, it said they were the worst hurricane to hit Florida since Hurricane Andrew. And I saw all these people in Mexico Beach saying, whoa, what about us? What about Hurricane Michael? We were already forgotten, not even a year later. So what I heard from these people over and over and over again was, tell our story. Don't let them forget that we're still struggling. We're still here, but we're still struggling. So if you don't know Mexico Beach, it is a small little beach town on the Gulf of Mexico. That's where it got its name. Mexico Beach is on the Gulf of Mexico. It's right here in the Panhandle. Has a population of about 1,500, or it did before Hurricane Michael. It's a little lower now. It's less than 2 square miles. So this is a really small town. Average age of 55. Mexico Beach is really made up of your residents who have been there for generations, a bunch of mom and pop restaurants and stores and hotels and bed and breakfasts, and then not tourists, but perennial vacationers. So those folks who are there year after year, month after month, who have been coming there for decades with their families. Folks that feel like Mexico Beach is as much their home as where they're from. I'm from Southwest Georgia, and during any kind of holiday, spring break, 4th of July, whenever you go to Mexico Beach, it feels like my entire town has descended on the place. People have duplexes they own, are renting, and they come back year after year after year. It's that little small beach town where the kids literally still ride bikes down the street. They leave in the morning, come back at dusk. Everybody knows everybody. And it's just get this nice, quaint feel to it. There's not a lot of chains. The grocery store is the Dollar General, and most of the restaurants are owned by locals. It's a lot different than the Panama City, which is not too far to the west, but it's a really small, close-knit, tight community. This is what a part of Mexico Beach looks like. You have Highway 98 running through the middle, and then beachside, everybody knows your location based on your street. So are you on 40th Street, 25th, 38th? That's the vernacular in Mexico Beach. So today I'm going to stick with that. If you're not familiar with Mexico Beach, it may seem weird, but that's how we do things. This is the canal on the west side. You can see all the boat slips. It's a big fishing town. People come in and go out and do fishing tournaments. And then here's a view from the pier. As you can see, hotels, little apartment complexes, hotels, townhomes. It looks like it's a lot of large buildings here, but most of these are just split duplexes and few-story townhomes, because most of the development here are small, one-story concrete block duplexes. So not a lot of McMansions. It's a very laid-back, middle-income, low-key beach town. So here's a picture of Mexico Beach before Hurricane Michael. Here's Mexico Beach after. The amount of devastation was hard to believe. Mexico Beach was literally wiped off the map by this storm. And the pictures you saw on the news don't do it justice. The level of devastation was unbelievable. Block after block just gone. House after house just gone. To give you an idea of what Mexico Beach looks like flood risk wise, this is the city. The portion to the west is mainly undeveloped at this time. And so you've got your, before Hurricane Michael, you had the effective 2009 flood maps, which included V zone, VE, AE, and A zones. And the regulations were the Florida Building Code minimum. So a foot above the BFE in the VE and the AE zone. And then in the approximate A zone, it was the highest adjacent grade +2 plus a foot. So our Florida freeboard. Now, after Hurricane Michael, the city very wisely adopted the preliminary maps that were out. So they're not official yet, but they went ahead and adopted them. They put a pause on any permitting to figure out what they were going to do. So they adopted the preliminary maps. And as you can see, a lot changed. X zone got added, X shaded, and a ton of the city went into the X shaded zone. But a lot of the AE zone went away. It got smaller, actually. In some areas, it enlarged, but mostly along the canals and all, it got smaller. But the X shaded zone covered a majority of the city. And so the city officials looked at the maps and looked at the data, looked at the storm surge, and decided the FEMA minimum is not good enough. So they actually went to the 500-year plus a foot and a half in all flood zones, AE, VE, X shaded, and A zone, if they were able to determine that 500-year plus a foot and a half in those zones. There was something they could tie it to. So this was the regulation that the city of Mexico Beach went into with rebuilding from Hurricane Michael. Now, 71% of the building infrastructure, the buildings in Mexico Beach were destroyed. 71% gone. 9% were severely damaged. And 20% were still standing. Still standing is a very low bar when you start seeing some of these houses. So the amount of devastation was citywide. Now, Hurricane Michael hit, and people evacuated. And then they came back to devastation that looked like a bomb had gone off. People couldn't find where their house was because the streets didn't make sense anymore. The tree devastation boggled the mind. And you might be asking, why are we talking about trees? Well, Panama City, not far to the west, was known as Tree City, USA before Hurricane Michael. And they lost 300,000 trees. And if you're not thinking about it, you may overlook the fact that trees are a very big part of flood control. Not only do the leaves catch rainfall through evapotranspiration and diminish it that way, but also trees drink a lot of water. 300,000 trees drink a ton of water. And so what's happening now is that when rain falls and it floods, the water doesn't go away because there's no trees drinking it anymore. The groundwater is just there and the rainwater fills up. The level of devastation from the wind on the tree infrastructure was hard to imagine. Of course, I kept getting pictures from people showing me the devastation over and over and over. Pictures, just people trying to wrap their heads around how it could be this bad. City blocks gone, houses in the middle of the streets, houses moved. The debris that was picked up was astronomical, and they're still cleaning it up. My parents, as I mentioned, have a place there with my brother. It's on 25th Street, and you may be familiar with it because you probably saw the red roof still standing. My parents was one of the red roof buildings that was still up after the storm. They had one of the units, it's a 4-unit townhome. They had one of the end units. It's interesting, when my parents first bought this place, my mom said, well, we're in the X zone, we're not getting flood insurance. And I quickly explained to her that they needed flood insurance anyway, and they were going to buy it. She likes to quote me that I said, Mom, if you flood, you're going to ruin my career if you don't have flood insurance. Unfortunately, a few years after they bought the house, they needed it. Fortunately, they had it. But they would have never dreamed, I would have never dreamed that within a couple of years, 2 or 3 years after buying the place, Michael would have hit. So you can see this is the damage. It doesn't look as bad from the outside because their place is still standing. But when you look inside and look into the building, it was gutted. The waves and storm gutted it. This is the storm surge that hit my parents' place. The water was 14 feet deep there. The water level inside the second story was 40 inches or so. And there's been some debate back and forth about the storm surge levels in Mexico Beach from Hurricane Michael. But there's no debate in my family because the kitchen on the second floor, the bowls in the cabinets had salt water in them. The water was there. Now, fortunately, the person who built the house had put in breakaway walls. They were in the X zone, didn't need to, didn't have to, but decided to anyway. That's why the building is still standing. My parents also had hurricane shutters and hurricane doors. However, when the bottom level pushed out, it opened up the wind envelope of the envelope of the house, and the wind got in. And so what happened is the wind actually went up that stairwell and pushed the storm doors out from the inside because there wasn't a door at the top of these stairs. That's in the building code. It requires, if you're in the flood zone with breakaway walls, that you have a storm equivalent door at the top of the stairs. But this house was built to a higher standard than was required. So no door was put at the top. So the wind actually got inside. And so the upper levels, the third and the fourth floor that weren't subject to the storm surge, wound up getting severe damage because the storm windows were pushed out from the inside, and the rain got in, and the force of the waves was so strong the stairwell actually shifted in the house. Here's a view from their porch. As you can see, the houses that were there were gone after Hurricane Michael. Another view, just devastation, just houses disappearing. Like I said, just the concrete slabs remained. Most of these houses weren't even built with rebar connecting them to the slab. They were just block homes set on top of the slab. A lot of these houses have been there since the 50s, 40s, and 60s. And so the risk, they were built prior to the flood maps and prior to the current floodplain management era. The pictures can't do justice to the level of damage and devastation that Mexico Beach experienced. Over and over, this is my parents' neighbor, and these people lived there year round. These were their houses. These weren't vacation houses, and they lost it all. Most of them didn't have flood insurance because they didn't have mortgages and didn't think they needed it. They were in the X zone. This is a campground full of mobile homes. And of course, the wind came through and wiped them out. Throughout the campgrounds, this is the level of devastation that it was there after Michael. And then I kept getting pictures from people saying, this is what they came back to. They left their house and evacuated and came back to a slab with nothing. Julie's house, seen from above, actually pushed across the street into her neighbor's house by the waves. Over and over, just the devastation and destruction that came from real people. These individuals just sharing their stories about what they lost. Terry proudly staying in front of his house, and the only thing left after the storm were 2 uprooted palm trees. My friend Amanda Horn from high school, this was her parents' place, and this was their regular family vacation. Her kids and her brother-in-law's kids growing up in this place. They didn't have flood insurance because they didn't know they needed it. And they were in the X zone. And this was their house after the storm. Gutted. Because they don't have flood insurance, the money to rebuild is not there. So they're trying to decide still, do they stay or do they leave? A lot of developers are coming in trying to buy property, and the Mexico Beach folks are trying to hold on because they don't want their community to change. But some folks don't have a choice. And Angie and Christy saw their destruction from the news. They realized their duplex was gone when they saw the pink and the blue blocks in the debris and the rubble. Diane came back to find that even though she had been on pilings, it wasn't quite tall enough. So her foundation is there to a degree, but warped and buckled because of the waves. Ruth's place, the only thing left in her area was her neighbor's chimney. She found her porch railings laying on the ground, but nothing else. This house doesn't seem to have gotten much damage. The underneath was washed away a little bit, but not too bad, until you realize it's pressed up against the neighbor. And then you look and you find out it was a 4-story house. And these are just the 2 top stories. The waves somehow set down the top 2 stories, and they were able to salvage stuff out of that part of the house. Joy and her sister walking back from finding out the only thing they had left were pilings. Vicky's house, now she can look straight through it. Over and over, the stories that came in, the pictures. My friend Tasha Rogers from high school, this was her parents' place. And so they spent summers and spring breaks here. And her husband owned a duplex right down the street. And after Michael, both were gone, wiped away. Miramar Circle, Miramar Drive, this is the area along the canal, full of a lot of townhomes and a lot of more recent construction. This is definitely an area of expansion for the city. So a lot of this construction was designed to a higher standard. And so while a lot of the structures still stand, the waves gutted them. And some of them were even moved, and so not intact. And some just wiped off the map. Pam found out her house was destroyed when she saw through her roof on the news. They've rebuilt and trying to put things back together, but they still just have a shell. Trying to figure out how to pay for rebuilding. Mexico Beach doesn't have a lot of big stores, doesn't have chains, so everything's little mom and pop shops. The grocery store is a Dollar General, and so when you lose the infrastructure like this, like the markets, it's hard to recover. It's hard to make it back. Little bed and breakfasts that just got so much devastation and destruction. Mango Marley's, one of the prime restaurants there, mom and pop place, gone. Toucans, your typical Jimmy Buffett style live music, oysters, raw oyster kind of restaurant on the beach, gone, washed away. Toucans, you can see the hotel behind it, but nothing was left of Toucans. The only gas station in town, the Exxon right by Toucans, also devastated. They just opened back up about a month ago and are still having trouble. 10 months after Michael, things were still either stalled or slowly being repaired. Elisa Savaggio, who a lot of you probably know, has been with ASFPM, a member of ASFPM for years, does recovery work for FEMA. And these are some pictures she took, both of the devastation and the hope of Mexico Beach after the storm. This church still trying to hold on, still trying to rebuild. 18 months after Michael, some things are back, some things were rebuilt. But a lot of it was still in flux, and a lot of it hadn't even begun yet. And so it was hard to figure out what the path forward looked like. Now, I mentioned the regulations that Mexico Beach had adopted. So right after the storm, they went from the minimum standard in the Florida Building Code to a higher standard. They realized that the bare minimum couldn't protect them. They had seen the devastation. So here you can see a large portion of Mexico Beach and just being wiped out. And here's an overlay that will show you just where the X shaded zone is. So as you can see, there's my parents' house in the X shaded zone. And if we're comparing, and so in the X shaded zone, they had to build to the 500-year plus 1.5 feet. So if we're comparing the Hurricane Michael storm surge to the minimum standard, the regulations were still so many feet lower than the Hurricane Michael storm surge. And there's always the debate about, can you protect to every storm? No. And so do we need to rebuild to protect from Michael or to a acceptable risk? And so that's been the discussion and debate in Mexico Beach for a while. And so the 500-year plus 1.5 feet was a higher standard, a much higher standard. And yet it was still so far below the Michael storm surge. The irony here is that so many people pushed back on this regulation, and it was really hard for the city commissioners to defend this and stand by it, because so many people didn't understand why are you regulating us to a higher standard? Why can't we just go back to what FEMA was doing? And so the logic of doing the bare minimum is what got us here really didn't click with a lot of people. In reality, you had your silent majority who supported the new regulations, but the vocal minority who pushed back really hard. So today, my parents are rebuilt. They just got their CO about 4 weeks ago. Their neighbors, a couple of their neighbors in that same unit are still rebuilding. And of course, their neighbors around them, some haven't even started. They're still trying to figure out what it looks like. So there's a long path back for Mexico Beach. Only about 10% of the housing inventory has been rebuilt. And so when you look at that, 71% was eliminated, 9% was severely damaged, and my parents' place being the 20% still standing. There's a long road to go, but we're making progress. Now, a year ago when I gave this at the Florida conference, I got to end this presentation with excitement. and hope. And when I submitted this abstract in October for ASFPM, I still had that hope. Because as I looked at this devastation, I saw the comparison and that all this X-shaded area, we're going to build back safely. It's not going to be perfect, but it is going to be higher. We're going to put them on piles, get up above some of the storm surge, and be resilient. And so in February, I emailed the city commissioners. And I've been to city commission meetings, and so they know me. And I just said, thank you. Thank you for the work you've done. I'm really glad that you have focused on the resilience of your city. And you're making sure that Mexico Beach is going to be around for the next generation and for your kids' kids. Because the next storm is going to come at some point. It's not if, it's when. And so I sent that email in February. And a week later, I got a response from someone. I got an immediate response from a city commissioner saying, thank you. But then about a week later, I got an email from an undisclosed source saying, I saw your email. Apparently you didn't know Mexico Beach changed the regulations in December. Even after this level of devastation, and as you can see, most of that area is X shaded. The city commission reduced their regulations. They went from 500 plus 1.5 feet back to BFE plus 1.5 feet in the VE and the AE zone. And so this is only 0.5 foot higher than the Florida minimum. And then for some reason, in the X shaded, they abandoned the flood elevation and decided to go with the crown of road, 18 inches above crown of road. In a lot of your communities, you recognize that a height above a crown of road regulation is to allow positive drainage away from buildings. So when the rain falls, there's not, your house is not filling up in a bathtub. It can flow away from over the road and away from your house. But look here, you've got Highway 98 sloping down, everything below that is sloping down towards the beach. When rain falls here, it flows to the ocean anyway. So why are they protecting these houses from rainfall flooding? The idea that this regulation replaced the 1.5 feet above 500 year doesn't make logical sense, because that's not a storm surge regulation. This area that got wiped off the map is being protected, not from the storm surge that did it, but from the rainfall that's going to go into the ocean anyway. The commissioners caved. And I've been trying to think of a better way to say that and a more accurate way to say it. But right now, Mexico Beach is hurting. And this place means something to me. And so I'm not going to whitewash it. I'm not going to pat somebody on the back for caving and not doing their job. They did such a phenomenal job after the storm. And yet at some point in time, lost their drive, lost their battle. I don't know. So I'm still trying to figure this out, and I'm still fighting to have these regulations brought back for something to make sense, because it's not if a next hurricane hits, it's when. And with these current level of regulations, this devastation is going to be back. If you look at my parents' place, the Hurricane Michael storm surge was in the second story. The 500 foot plus 1.5 feet was in the bottom story. According to these new regulations, they can rebuild on the dirt. Their neighbors whose houses are still gone, who are still slabs, can rebuild on the dirt. Maybe they have an 18-inch slab or 24-inch slab, but there's no elevation, there's no pile requirements. So the 10% of the housing infrastructure that's already there is going to be on piles. And all these other people who have complained about not being able to build on the grade are being allowed to. And what's going to happen is the next time a storm comes through, Mexico Beach is not going to recover. They're not going to make it. We often talk about how right after the storm is the time to capture people's attention, because mitigation happens when memories are fresh. And so here we are 26 months after Hurricane Michael, and they've already forgotten. But it didn't even take that long. I was at a city commission less than 10 months after Hurricane Michael city commission meeting, And I listened to a resident demand that they stop trying to protect him from Hurricane Michael because Hurricane Michael was gone. And he said, I don't understand why we can't just rebuild back to the FEMA maps. And this was somebody whose house was gone, somebody whose house got washed away by the waves. He had nothing but a slab, and yet he was asking to be able to build right back to the level. We've got to do better. And I don't know what next steps are. Like I said, when I get this presentation last year, I was hopeful. I don't know what lies ahead for Mexico Beach. I'm afraid. Everybody's pulled together to be not for sale. That's been one of the big slogans of Mexico Beach is we're not for sale. The big developers that have come in and wanted to completely change Mexico Beach, they've said we're not for sale. And yet they sold themselves out over this regulation. When the next storm comes through, I don't know what Mexico Beach looks like. I don't know what it looks like in 10 years, but I'm going to keep fighting. But what I want you to remember from this presentation is the people who are still struggling. And the path back is still unknown. And it looks a little darker than it did 7 months ago.
Okay, thank you so much for your participation in this session. Really love to hear the great conversation that we have had to date via the chat. Let's keep that going as we get into future sessions. We do have Dell here with us. Dell, thanks for sharing your powerful story and the story of your family, especially coming from someone with such deep expertise in this area. It's an important one to hear. One question that came through, what standard did your folks' home build back to? Did they consider building above the high water mark? How high from the grade would that have been? And was it even feasible to build to that height?
Well, since their building was actually still standing, they rebuilt as is. But the high water mark was 40 inches into their second story. So it would not have been feasible to rebuild to that. To elevate a 4-story building up another 4 feet. Yeah, it's really hard to watch this, Matt. I didn't realize how hard it was going to hit me watching this back.
Mm. Well, thank you. And let's get you one more question. Thank you again. So Alyssa writes, heartbreaking on the reduction change, but being a local, do you think it is so people can get their sense of community built back? It's been 2 years and so many can't even get started on building. What could we do to keep the level of awareness up so people choose to build more than just the regulations?
The reduction in the standards was based on the, because of the silent majority. The very vocal people, you had a small group of people who were really vocal, really adamant, and they kept badgering the commission. But the sense of community was not lost. I mean, it's still there. The people are rebuilding. People are in trailers just trying to get their permits going. So the reduction in these rules was not because of the lack of community. It was because the folks who supported the rules didn't speak up as loud as the folks who were against them.
Got it. Yeah, so tough. We need to give everybody a seat at the table, but making sure that each voice is heard at equal volume is tough. We have a bunch of comments here. I do think we need to keep rolling with 2 other presentations. I will maybe ask you real quick 2 questions about mitigation, planning, and funding. Did the community have a hazard mitigation plan, or were there a lot of local grant-funded mitigation projects?
Mexico Beach had a steep learning curve on all of this. So if they had a plan, it was on a bookshelf, and that's about as far as it went. And they were just, after the storm, everything was gone, and they were just trying to play catch up. So anything and everything was thrown at the walls. And I'm still surprised and amazed at the level of regulations they implemented, because I think it was a fantastic step. But yeah.
Got it. Well, again, thank you for sharing your story. It's not often we get to hear from pros in the field who have such a strong personal experience. So thank you for that. I'm going to dump all existing questions that we didn't get to into the chat so folks can see those, and perhaps we can continue the dialogue. Dell, if you're able to put your email in there, or if you want to shout it out real quick so that folks can follow up with you, that'd be great. All right, awesome. So we're going to keep rolling here to our next presentation, which comes from Bill Smith. So Bill Smith's is called Rolling on the River. It's about the 2019 Arkansas River Park flood and the remediation efforts that he documented and oversaw. So Bill is the president of Hydropower International Services, International Consultancy. It's a private consulting firm providing engineering services for hydroelectric generating projects and other hydrologic, hydraulic, and floodplain management projects. Mr. Smith has almost 50 years of hydrology and hydraulic engineering experience in stormwater and floodplain management. He is a certified floodplain manager since 2004 and has been a member of the Oklahoma Floodplain Managers Association since January of that same year. So let's roll to the video, but I will leave the questions up in the chat for another moment or two for Dell's presentation. Then we'll clear those out and look forward to an interesting dialogue with Bill when we roll back after his video. Thanks, everybody.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill Smith. I'm a hydrologist, and I've been studying the Arkansas River for about 47 years. My presentation today relates to the May-June 2019 flooding on the Arkansas River through Tulsa as it relates to the River Parks Authority trail system and the bed and banks of the Arkansas over a 6-mile stretch. The Arkansas River has a contributing drainage area of about 22,000 square miles upstream of Tulsa. And since the regulation of the river began in 1964 with Keystone Dam on the Arkansas and Caw Dam in Kansas on the Arkansas, the flooding is significantly less than it used to be. However, we still have significant floods. The 2019 flood was different than the historic high flood in 1986, where the peak flow was 303,000 cubic feet per second. The May-June flood of 2019 was 275,000, but it occurred and lasted over a 53-day period, which totally inundated the overbank sand areas adjacent to the river. And so when the waters finally receded, there was significant flooding along the Arkansas River and greatly affected the River Parks trail system. River Parks Authority is a quasi-city county authority along with private funding that has developed since 1976, and the recreational trails and park systems, Turkey Mountain recreation area, and now the gathering place, which was the single largest privately funded park in the world that has received numerous awards since its inception about 4 years ago, we're all affected by the 2019 flood. The Arkansas River Parks trail system starts at 11th Street, which is just down about a mile south of downtown Tulsa at the I-244 and 11th Street Bridge, which is historic Route 66. And as you can see in these next few slides, each one of those dots is a damage area. River Parks had me do the post-flood assessment about 2 days after the floodwaters began to recede, and we identified bank damage, trail damage as we move south. There's 6 miles of, as I say, 6 miles of trails that were assessed in about 87 different locations along the trail system that and the banks that were damaged. And we're down now at the southern end near 71st Street, where we finished assessment. Trying to determine how to remediate the numerous damaged areas, I prioritized them by high priority, which meant that there was a public safety issue or there was actual damage to the physical trail that affected the public. Medium priority, which was bank sloughing and erosion, but no immediate impact or public safety issues. And then low priority volunteer projects. These were areas where there was sand deposition on the trails, trail limbs, erosion of the trail gravel, debris, etc. And there were actually hundreds of volunteers that came out immediately after the flooding and began to clean up the trails and parks. River Parks had so many volunteers that they set up a system to coordinate the volunteer effort. I'm going to show you several high priority projects, and these were the most significant ones. And for these projects, I designed specific remediation measures for the repair. Here at Area 34, which is near Peoria and Riverside Drive, there was severe bank erosion, as you can see in the upper pictures. The trail was undermined, and you can see in the bottom sections where we used embankment fill, covered it with a I call it cable concrete. They were concrete blocks, panels that were wired together in lieu of using a lot of riprap. We did surround the panels with riprap at the toe along the river and on the upstream and downstream sides in this situation. Here at Area 35, we call this the Feldman deck. This was an area where you can see the deck in the upper left-hand corner. A family had donated this as a memorial to their daughter, and the bank had completely eroded away. I mean, the top of the bank was about 20 feet to the east of the edge of the deck railing. And so we brought it in, reestablished the riverbank, again used the cable concrete type covering to protect the fill material, and then used riprap at the toe of the slope and on the upstream and downstream sides to prevent undermining. Area 28 near Riverside Drive is a large area that was donated by Quick Trip in Tulsa, and has a large splash pad area for the children during the summer. The river overtopped the pump vault by about 3 feet and literally collapsed the wall of the pump station. And so the entire pump station had to be removed and a new pump station put in place, and in order to make it work efficiently. Last week, we just started up and completed all of the repairs, so it was ready for the May 1st opening. And then the last high priority project that we did was scouring on the west bank near 36th Street, which is in the Turkey Mountain area, recreation area, where there was severe bank damage and trail damage. And this trail is about 30 feet above normal water level. And so when the river flooded for such an extensive time, it undermined the trail, collapsed it, and caused scouring. And this trail is used every day by hundreds of people. And so this has been everybody's grateful that it's finally remediated and back. These were the 4 high priority projects that we did formal design and construction bidding and construction on, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The damage estimates by priority were estimated almost to be $2 million for the total 17 high priority projects. And as you can see, the actual cost for the 4 projects was just over $1 million. The medium priority, which have not been designed and only some constructed to date, for those 33 projects is estimated at $2.4 million. And then the low priority projects, where there has all the damage and construction has basically been done by volunteers or staff, was estimated to be about $57,000. And most of those low priority volunteer projects have already been completed. Another medium priority project that has been completed is the jetty restoration. In 1982, when HISIINC Dam was created for recreational purposes, a marina was created for paddle boats and access into a calm river area. And the jetty that created the marina area was severely damaged, and so River Parks Authority took on and had volunteer contractors come out and remediate the marina area. On some of the medium priority projects, and you can see the FEMA project number and overall assignment number. This was near 11th Street, where you can see how the bank was eroded on the left picture and how the area was restored on the right. These were some projects that River Parks Authority took on themselves with some of their local funding, volunteer funding. Here's another one. Again, you can see the erosion that occurred adjacent to the bank and how it was restored and reseeded. And here was a final picture that construction has been completed on. And as I say, there's still a number of those projects that River Parks will continue to work on over time as funds are available to try and restore the banks prior to the next flooding, because there will be another flooding. So after the flooding began and looking at restoration, the City of Tulsa, River Parks Authority, and the Gathering Place started discussing with FEMA public assistance. And the public assistance for the River Parks Authority basically would restore the banks to pre-flood conditions. One of the assumptions was that when we place sand in the river, which was the original bank system, that we would be able to put slope protection on it to keep it in place. Otherwise, the daily power releases from Keystone Dam will start to scour the toe of the fill material, and the restoration will fail. However, we soon learned after construction was underway that placing slope protection, either riprap or the cable concrete panels, is considered by FEMA to be mitigation. And mitigation for public assistance has to be pre-approved by the Oklahoma Emergency Management. And without that pre-approval, it was not eligible for payment. And I had several discussions with the technical people at FEMA, and their comments were, well, there wasn't riprap there in the first place, so if you're placing riprap, it's considered to be mitigation, and therefore, unless it was pre-approved, it is not eligible for reimbursement under public assistance. And I kept saying, well, it's absurd to just place sand back to restore the natural bank that was created over generations, centuries, literally, that was compacted by flooding and geotechnical pressure, and to just try and put back sand. And they said, sorry, it's not reimbursable. Absurd, absolutely absurd. So the unintended consequence of this future damage mitigation approach was to inflate the expectations of River Parks Authority for federal aid that FEMA through the federal government might provide. And so as we began our meetings, and this was after the initial site reviews with the FEMA responders for public assistance, and this was after the bidding was done, after construction was done, to try and determine how to achieve any kind of financial reimbursement for this mitigation. And as I said, much of that was outside of the scope of FEMA policies. One of the other issues that we had was during the initial site investigations, which created the DDD forms, the FEMA created confusion because it first required that each of the 87 damaged locations be damaged as a separate site, and then they reversed their course and said, let's combine some of those sites into more general single projects. So that led to confusion as to what project, what specific site was in what project. And again, no consideration for remediation was really the biggest one. The number of rivers in the United States that are populated and have bank erosion, we certainly understand that FEMA has to draw the line somewhere, but it would have been nice to know all of that before we went into the public assistance process. So when we look towards reimbursement, the goal through public assistance is that 75% of the funding will come from FEMA through the federal government, 11.25% will come from the state, and 11.25% comes from the entity, in this case, River Parks Authority. However, in the end, where River Parks is only receiving about 45% of the funding, they're receiving no funds from the state because the state of Oklahoma has no funds set aside for reimbursement under PA. And so all of the rest of the money had to come from River Parks Authority, emergency funds, and they had to borrow from their 2020 and 2021 capital improvement budget. So those projects that were planned for have gone back into the set aside on the back burner for future years. River Parks Authority also rehired one of their original staff members, and he served as an in-house general contractor to manage a crew of 3 or 4 contract workers, and used authority or rented equipment to complete a lot of the some of the medium and low priority repairs. And so that was much more cost effective than engaging the outside contractors on extensive engineering design projects. And it's worked very well. They have been very successful on that. One final project is the West Bank berm. This was partially destroyed during the 1976 flood event, and that was a berm, not a levee, and it was constructed when the Public Service Company of Oklahoma power plant was constructed in the 20s. The area was a labor camp at the time of the construction of the plant and has been a West Bank soccer field for many years. And this temporary berm that you see was constructed overnight by one of the contractors in order to mitigate flooding of residential and industrial areas off to the west. And they spent about $90,000 hauling in riprap and gravel and shale to create a berm. This berm has since been removed, and much of that material was used in the mitigation projects that you saw before. I have designed a new restoration of the levee or the berm that was originally there, and that has been turned over to the city of Tulsa or Tulsa County, depending on who's going to actually do the construction. Under FEMA jurisdiction, the berm itself is in Tulsa County, but the river bottom where the toe of the berm is in city of Tulsa jurisdiction. So they'll have to work out who's going to repair the future berm. So that's kind of a wrap up of what we did in 2019 flood remediation. If you have any questions, I am available, and I appreciate your time.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that presentation, Bill. If you have questions for Bill, please drop them in the chat here and we'll get him responding to those now. I certainly have a few for you, Bill. Number one, I wanted to know, when the crews are out there working, when you're doing assessments, what are the kinds of things that you hear from walkers and joggers about those kinds of projects to remediate some of that storm damage?
So when it first began, we had the trail closed, and of course everybody was angry because they couldn't be on the trail. And that was part of the reason we had hundreds of volunteers come out, because they wanted their trail back. The areas where, like that first area where the trail was actually broken off, we just did a detour around it so that they could be on it. But it was real interesting as I would go out and talk to I'd be out there with the contractors, and the number of people that come and say, "What are you doing?" And so I would explain to them. So there was so much public outreach on, they didn't understand why the flooding caused the damage, and then why were you doing the remediation the way you were. And so there were a lot of interested people.
Yeah, great learning opportunity, right? And hopefully people remember that as they continue to walk their dogs, push a stroller, whatever it may be.
Yep.
Curious also, what were some of the local government partners and community groups, beyond the obvious ones, that you had to work with to get buy-in, to make sure that people had real strong support for these projects?
So because the Arkansas River is a jurisdictional river, we had to work with the Corps of Engineers on 404. Because it was a mitigation of a flood event, we were exempt from having to actually get a 404 because we were just restoring the bank to where it was. So we didn't have that. The DEQ 401 water quality certification fell into the same issue. We didn't really have to do that. We did apply for the city of Tulsa is a CRS2 community. And so we did have to apply for a floodplain development permit for them. Again, because it was partially a city project, that didn't become an issue. They did issue a permit. They did review my plans on some of them. But for the most part, especially like under Corps of Engineers, if you're less than a tenth of an acre, and a lot of these 87 locations were less than a tenth of an acre, there really wasn't any permitting that was required, just, prudent reconstruction.
Great, thank you. I'm always curious about that, what community perception may be on a project after an event. And I'm going to apologize right now if you hear kids in the background. Everyone's home from school now, so this is life, right? Question came in from the audience. Were resiliency projects such as reconnecting the river with the floodplain or vegetation enhancements considered over just hard armor bank protection?
So that was part of the reason we went with the cable concrete, so that if anybody's familiar with cable concrete, it's concrete, literally blocks. They're 10 inches by 6 inches deep, cabled together, but the voids in between them are filled with topsoil, and then they're reseeded. And so today, if I drive down there, because it's green now, you can't see the cable concrete. It's all grass. So, and you can mow on it, you can weed eat it, whatever. So, and they've used the cable concrete in a number of places, and the places where they had done the cable concrete back in 2016, 17, there was no bank erosion at all in those locations.
Interesting, good to hear. One last question from the audience, and then we'll move to our final presentation of the evening. And that one, Bill, is you mentioned that building back better was not allowed under public assistance. Since then, is anything being done to help mitigate future flooding or future flooding damage?
Okay, so it was a learning experience, and this will happen again. And if it happens again, and I'm still working, I will work closely with the FEMA responders as they come out and do the initial DDD assessments. And before we ever go out for bids, we'll work with the Department of Emergency Management and get pre-approval on mitigation efforts. I'm sorry, it just irritates me to no end that they expect you just put sand back in the river without any protection on it. It's the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
Well, let's see. Any other final comments before we roll to our third video, Bill? Appreciate everything you've shared so far today. All right, so then we will move to our final presentation of the afternoon, which is titled Responding to Near Drowning with Resilient Actions, a Real-World Example. We have two presenters with us today. We have Dan Fricke of the JEO Consulting Group, and we also have John Callan, also, I believe, with JEO. So we're going to roll to that video as soon as I give you a quick bio for Dan, who's our lead presenter for this last presentation. So Dan Fricke is a senior project manager in water resources at JEO Consulting, where he has worked for over 15 years. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and serves as a board member of the Nebraska Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association. Dan's focus is large-scale flood risk reduction planning and implementation for communities across the Midwest. He was involved in the emergency response in the days following the record flooding in Fremont, Nebraska, and has continued to serve the city in their resilient actions. Dan champions flood risk reduction using every tool available and is especially fond of non-structural flood risk reduction and flood risk awareness outreach and communications efforts. Dan, a man after my own heart. Let's go ahead and roll to the video, and we'll be back with questions for Dan shortly. And John.
Hello, my name is Dan Fricke. I'm an engineer with JEO Consulting Group out of Omaha, Nebraska. And with me, actually, for probably the Q&A session is actually one of my colleagues, John Callan. He's also an engineer with us. And happy to be here today at the conference. And I'd like to thank the conference, the association and the committee for setting this up and making it work given the pandemic situation that's going on right now. And I hope everybody is staying safe. What I'd like to talk to you about today is a project area and a number of communities we're working with currently, the history of a specific area in Nebraska, and a specific flood event and what they experienced, and then looking forward to some of the things that came out of that particular flood event and what they're seeing as far as opportunities for resiliency looking forward. So like I said, based in Nebraska, and the area that we're actually looking at is, if you're familiar with, it's Omaha and it's west of Omaha a little bit, it's Dodge County. And so you see there are a number of communities within Dodge County, including Fremont, the southeast corner, as well as a number of others along the Platte and Elkhorn rivers. This particular area of Nebraska is kind of at the receiving end of some of the larger rivers in Nebraska. On the east side or the right side of this particular graphic, you'll see the city of Omaha. And the Missouri River flows there, and then the Platte River is on the south side and kind of comes in from the west. And this screen cap is actually from the National Levee Database, and you see in red the federal levee infrastructure, and purple the non-federal levee infrastructure. And then actually there's a number of other non-levee embankments built for various purposes, including flood control and other things that we'll talk about. But it's a very busy area. And just so we have kind of a place, so to speak, we've got the Platte River, which comes from the west. We'll talk about that a little bit. And the Oklahoma River, which is highlighted going north, is a left bank tributary of the Platte River that impacts this particular area. And of particular interest to this particular presentation is the area at and west of Fremont. So call it the Platte River Corridor. In this particular area, there are, again, a number of core federal and non-federal levee embankments, as well as some other ones that impact the conveyance and flood risks in these areas. So some of the history through developing this particular presentation, I was able to work with the city, and they provided me actually a document that essentially was a family documentation of the history and some of the founding fathers of Fremont in particular. And I found it extremely fascinating, so I pulled some excerpts out for this. But what stood out to me was that this document went back to the mid to late 1800s as far as documentation goes. I think it was written in the early portions of them were written in the early 1900s or focused on that time frame. And flooding was always something that they were dealing with, it seemed like. And one of the interesting parts about this particular area of Nebraska is some of you may know Nebraska, at least certain areas of it can be very flat. And this particular area is much that way, essentially being in the floodplain of two of Nebraska's largest rivers. So much so that if water gets out in flooding, it can spread literally miles. And so I just found it was interesting that anecdotally was actually seen as well, potentially 8 miles of flooding from bluff to bluff, so to speak. And again, a little kind of an interesting little tidbit as far as living next to the river. But this particular area is kind of unique in another sense. One is the topography, where if water gets out, it really can spread for miles, and it's interrupted by man-made and natural features, but man-made features such as roads, railroads, levees, et cetera. In addition to that, though, they actually kind of have 3 different flood risks, and those come from local rainfall events, snowmelt events, as well as ice jams and overflows. And so they are really there's really not a lot of downtime when it comes to flood risk in this particular area. And so some of the things that, again, through this document, it documented some of the things that they had looked at previously, both the Corps as well as local interests and the railroads, who were major players back then. These are some of the mitigation, flood mitigation activities that were considered previously. And I've got a few of these highlighted in blue. And what I think is interesting is the Corps Omaha district is actually still in the process of doing a Section 205 / general investigative study for the city of Fremont in this area. And those particular blue highlighted items are actually things the Corps has looked at. They've essentially determined them to be infeasible in this particular situation. But I found it interesting that it's literally over 100 years later, we're still kind of looking at the same things. Another thing I thought was interesting was the railroad, I'm sure taking their experience from other areas in the country, suggested and actually did make their bridge span smaller. And the thought was to speed up the water and the ice that came through there to scour out and push it through. And needless to say, that didn't work out too well. But anyway, it was interesting. It was an interesting read to kind of look at some of the history there. So of particular interest to this discussion is what we call the 2019 event, or the 2019 flood, the March 2019 flood event. What precipitated this or preceded it was a period of time of extreme cold, which created deep frost across a large chunk of really the Midwest, especially Nebraska. And in Nebraska, a lot of times our rivers will freeze over. And in this particular case, because it was so cold, the rivers were, and a lot of them were frozen to depths of multiple inches up to, I think, 3 feet is kind of some of the stuff I've seen or heard about. And so you had frozen rivers, deep frost, and then on top of that, in February, you had a basically record snowfall, or above average snowfall, I should say, significantly so, as you can see there by the numbers. Couple that with a period of rapid warming, went from freezing to, I think, in the 60s over a period of 10 days. And then as a whole part of this system, Winter Storm Ulmer rolled in. And for those of you familiar with geography, you see the outline of Nebraska there, the yellow, or excuse me, the red circle is actually that Dodge County, Fremont area. And I mentioned some of the rivers here, but really Fremont is kind of at the crossroads of a few different major ones, including the Platte, which is the largest one, and actually drains a good chunk of Nebraska as well as portions of Wyoming and Colorado, the Loop and the Elkhorn rivers. And so those are the watersheds you see highlighted there. And this is a graphic of Winter Storm Ulmer. And what happened was, a period of a system of extreme low pressure, bombogenesis for weather folks. It created extreme high winds in western Nebraska. There were blizzard conditions. And in eastern Nebraska, there was 2 to 3 inches of rainfall across a large region of Nebraska, and actually a multi-state region. This wasn't just isolated Nebraska. Neighboring states also got hit very hard. And so, essentially, there was a situation where the event was so large and regional in nature that any systems that did exist were extremely tested. Everybody really was all hands on deck across the region. And so I've seen a number, I think 30 different stream gauges in the region broke records. And we're not talking by like just a little bit, we're talking multiple feet breaking records. And exacerbating the response issues with this particular event was that not only were there bad conditions, but they actually caused a lot of roads to be closed, and bridges and culverts failed. And so literally the road was closed, they couldn't get through. And so I was out and about, doing response activities. And I remember quite a bit of detours that occurred both immediately and for really months after. There was quite a bit of devastation. Significant evacuations. Utility systems, I'm talking like drinking water, systems and wastewater systems were essentially wiped out and compromised. And in particular to Fremont, the Fremont area, it's not a small community. It's about 25,000 people. And it essentially became an island. There was no way to effectively get in over land. And so, I've got some family in medicine, and they were actually airlifting medical supplies, personnel to be able to staff the city's needs for quite a while. And just to illustrate kind of the regional nature of this thing, on the right-hand side, you see satellite imagery. From the top was March of 2019, and on the bottom is March of 2020, which the 2020 was just kind of a sample of what may be typical in March. And you can see the river systems, both the Platte, Elkhorn, and Missouri, are extremely gorged with water, the runoff. And so this has been kind of a unique tool to be able to dissect some of the stuff that's been going on. And so I'll talk about, so I got involved with some of the response activities, and between that and just kind of knowing the area from previous work and being from the area, it's an extremely busy corridor, busy with respect to hydraulics as well, how I'll put it. there's levee and non-levee embankments throughout. We've talked about a few of those. In addition to that, there's a number of agricultural ditches that not only are they ditches, but they also include kind of levees on either side of it as well, for agricultural drainage purposes. In addition to that, one of the unique things about this particular corridor is that if you ever get a chance to walk across the Platte River, it's a sand bed river, and you can do that most of the summer a lot of times. But as a result of the material that gets moved down the river system, there's a lot of aggregate mining, sand and gravel mining. And so what you see here highlighted, I've kind of called out here on the slide, is a number of what essentially are sandpit lakes. So once the aggregate mining is completed from hydraulic dredging, once a site is exhausted, oftentimes those are turned over for recreation and residential developments. And so I'll show you a picture of some of that in the future slide, but long story short, they have an interesting impact on the hydraulics of the area. So right after the event, really the day after this happened, essentially some of the emergency management and leadership there put a call out for help. And so through another organization, I actually became part of an emergency response team. And we were tasked in that particular case with looking at really what was going on. This event was unprecedented. Folks, didn't really know what had happened in its entirety. It had just occurred. It wasn't like a textbook channel where the water comes up and it goes back down. Water literally got out everywhere. And so you'll see to the west here, there's another community of North Bend. And so the Platte River actually broke out there. And then there was a actual levee breach at the Ames Dike. And between the overflows, levees breaking, as well as non-levee embankments failing and being overtopped, my lights are going to turn off here. I apologize for that. But gotta love green energy here. So anyway, we found that it was an extremely complicated and interconnected system of infrastructure that no one community was really or entity was really responsible for. And in fact, it was so connected that essentially there was a cascading effect of potential impacts or real impacts. So the upstream one caused the next downstream one and the next downstream one to fail. The breach that I called out there, the Ames Dike, you can see I've got superimposed a line there that kind of shows where the alignment should be. During this response, there were still relatively high flows. It wasn't as bad as obviously during the flooding, but and we estimated that a large percentage of the flow going through this corridor was actually bypassing and going through the breach. And then the bottom left picture is actually looking downstream of the breach. And so that's actually typically row crop. And you can see the sand and water and channels sand that was deposited, channels that were cut through this agricultural land as a result of this. And as I kind of showed on the previous slide, that water just kind of kept going downstream until it hit Fremont and then ultimately discharged back to the river. This is an example of those sandpit lakes that I was telling you about earlier. So again, there's a number of them throughout this whole corridor. And, while they aren't necessarily modeled as levees, they aren't modeled as levees like in a floodplain mapping situation. They certainly impact the hydraulics of the area. And so again, I've superimposed a line that kind of shows where the levee or the embankment was. And they're not insignificant embankments. They're on the order of, multiple feet to 10, 15 feet tall. And essentially, they really created a situation that it was that domino effect, and it cascaded through and down through the system. So again, this is a little bit of a zoomed in version of what I showed previously, but the different flow paths and good and bad. Some of the infrastructure worked. So if you notice, for instance, these are called cutoff ditches associated with agricultural drainage. And I mentioned there are levees oftentimes on either side of the ditch. Well, essentially these became levees And in this case, they actually helped keep water out from going and bypassing Fremont and coming on the north side. What they did do though was they actually pushed water back into the system, and I've highlighted some of these breach locations that were identified in red. And so again, it was this extremely complicated and convoluted way to find how the water actually got into Fremont. It wasn't a simple solution, and what it resulted in was identifying a number of things needed. It wasn't any one piece of infrastructure that we could just go fix for the city or county or whoever could just go fix. It actually was a multiple pieces of infrastructure that all relied on each other and were impacted by each other's ability or inability to actually convey floodwaters. So again, as far as emergency response goes, the system was strained due to the regional nature. The resources were limited. Through preparation for this, I was able to kind of speak with some folks, including the emergency manager. He had actually just been on the job for less than a year when this occurred. He had background in emergency management, but still new to this particular area. Something he said struck me, and it's not necessarily what you know, it's who you know. And in this particular situation, it wasn't like a system that they could go operate. It wasn't a levee or a dam that they could go close an outlet or close an opening or something like that. It was literally the response effort. And so I'll touch on this later, but I felt it was super important to note that he really felt that it was about who you know, what leaders are able to provide help during these types of particular situations. Interesting to note, different groups or agencies. I've noted the County Emergency Board here, who's typically, my understanding is, duty is to deal with agricultural diseases. They were actually repurposed to acquire and help out with the food and water shortages that existed because of the limited access. And on top of all this, you have all this infrastructure that got damaged, and now there's holes and everything. And they're actually at the front end of their flood season. And so, needless to say, between the damages and devastation that already occurred, and then essentially looking at a flood season coming on with this essentially open infrastructure that could let more in, it was extremely tense, to say the least. And so, what did come out of this flood event, though, was that this flooding and the nature of it and the magnitude of it actually has helped prioritize the actions to be taken by these entities. And essentially, they were able to work backwards and have been working backwards from these local and acute issues to find solutions to things at a broader scale. I mentioned it earlier, but due to the interconnected nature of the infrastructure, there really is no single solution. In fact, the Corps, through their 205 study, presented and evaluated some fairly robust systems of levees and stuff like that would be, kind of that wall of defense on the west side of the city. And even they couldn't really find a solution that was amenable. So it really was corroborated by this particular flood event. And then, what came out of this was, in the months following, was that, again, it was acknowledged that all this infrastructure was tied together. No one entity had any jurisdiction over all of it. And in fact, some of them were abandoned, essentially, and they didn't really have anybody responsible for it. And so really they started to develop a vision for the resiliency of this area and what can be done. One of the most interesting things that I thought came out of it was it's called the Joint Water Management Advisory Board. And this is a group of 12 political subdivisions of varying types. And we figured out that there was no one solution. We were all going to have to work together. And so they came together. It's a kind of call it a non-binding board. It's not like they have authority or taxing authority in of themselves, but that's all still relegated to their own individual subdivisions. However, they come together to try to find solutions to this particular impact of flooding. And then once they've got some direction of idea of certain things to do, they'll actually go back to their respective boards and talk about, get authorization, whether it be funding or permission or whatever, to go after, to fund stuff or go after grants, et cetera. And it's been a great opportunity to actually get together, open it to the community, to voice concerns, collect information, et cetera. And so the graphic on the left is, I use it quite often because it's a great graphic. And so I've talked about a number of, floodplain impacts, structural impacts, et cetera. And so I felt this was kind of an implicit non-structural benefit of this particular, the outcome of this particular thing, where folks with mutually beneficial interests are coming together to find solutions. So I've kind of repurposed this. There's actually a document out there that was produced by the county and the Joint Water Management Agency or Advisory Board. And it kind of outlined their vision for the next few years. And that includes a combination of structural and non-structural mitigation. And so there's existing infrastructure that's out there. And so that's where, they're looking at improving or fixing the existing ones that had impacts on the particular flood event. There's also the potential for new ones, and that's where they've been successful in actually getting advanced assistance requests, as well as tapping into the new FEMA BRIC funding. And so that's kind of, it's infancy, it's just starting, but it's exciting, and they're extremely excited. Some of the non-structural things, there was and still is interest in the FEMA acquisitions and elevation program, non-structural stuff. In addition to this, the Corps actually had transitioned from their structural study to the non-structural components. And so between that going on, as well as some of the stuff we were actually doing, JEO was actually in the process of actually helping the region update their hazard mitigation plan. We were actually able to look at some of those acquisitions as well to complement what the Corps was doing. They're rightfully so interested in some river monitoring technology. And then we've also kind of been successful, the group has been successful in tapping into other funding sources, including NRCS and CDBG for emergent threats, and then some watershed planning. So it really is exciting to finally see some of this stuff start to come together. Granted, we're 2 years out, but nonetheless, still good. And so some of the challenges associated with this particular situation was that, again, it was unique hydrology and hydraulics. There's multiple flood risks. Once water gets out, it gets out, and it kind of spreads and goes a lot of different places. And so with that, it's shown that there's an opportunity to essentially challenge assumptions and not essentially challenge, but test what those assumptions might be in the sense of floodplain management. There's a floodplain map out there, and it's somewhat detailed. It's actually got with and without levee flood profiles, but as you saw in some of the video I had, the two-dimensional stuff actually have a time component and some evaluation of how those levee and non-levee embankments impact flooding and infrastructure. So in addition to this, you're dealing with significantly old infrastructure. Some of that document that I shared earlier is actually was written about levees that ended up failing in this particular event. And so, frankly, some of those hadn't been kept up, and certainly not to current standards, or even some standards that would allow that to perform well. So that certainly is a challenge, and understanding that has been the opportunity. Then looking back is working those things and figuring out how those things could be brought underneath an umbrella that would make sense. Another challenge is the timing. I call it strike while the iron's hot, or the inability to do so. I got the graphic on the right, and being funny here, but it really did feel like, it felt like working with the board, there was a lot of opportunity and a lot of interest to do a lot of stuff. And then you kind of get into that grant application pipeline and stuff like that. And it was very tough. And I guess we felt to really get a shared vision for what this could be, given that it wasn't just a one size fits all, one solution thing where, it's not like we could just go build this one thing and it would be solved. It literally was a county-wide effort that really each of them played into each other. And if one wasn't going to work, that would change the variable on another one. Another thing was, there is some success going on with elevation and acquisition, specifically acquisition. One of the towns in the watershed, Winslow, they're actually looking at moving the town entirely because it got hit so hard. And so that's a positive. On one of the challenges in Fremont, particularly, there was a number of homeowners that shortly after the flood were interested in some buyout and elevation opportunities. However, just due to timing, people lose interest, lose momentum. Some of those opportunities go away. So I think we were around 40 different structures were interested in some of those non-structural solutions, and I think they're down to like 2 now. And so 2 is better than nothing, but certainly frustrating to say the least. But what I will say though is really what modifications to the program would be great. But in addition to that, the way I like to think about it is the figure on the right. There's the disaster management cycle, where typically it's going in a clockwise direction. Now that we know those things, what can we do to go in counterclockwise? Why wait until the event occurs? Let's work backwards through hazard mitigation planning to actually do some of those things proactively ahead of the event, so that we're not necessarily repeating the cycle over and over again. Some of the successes that came out of this were the vulnerabilities were identified. Again, I mentioned challenge assumptions. The formation of that board was absolutely huge. And it's been a pleasure to see all that work and how that works, and folks coming together for a common cause. They've been, very successful at finding funding, and I'll basically give credit to some of the awesome staff there. They have been an absolute success when it comes to sticking with it, not necessarily not taking no for an answer, but finding a way, and we're finding a way to work within the system that does exist of getting successful grant applications, et cetera, submitted. And so kudos to them. And then again, I mentioned the hazard mitigation planning. We were actually able to integrate some of these things in the ongoing hazard mitigation stuff. And so we're looking forward to obviously future cycles as well, doing stuff similarly. And so with that, I'd just like to say thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you today. And special thanks to a number of folks who provided some information that helped me put this together. And I offered a little bonus clip at the bottom that I just found entertaining. So with that, I hope you guys have a great rest of the conference, and it's great to be with you today. Thank you.
Great. Dan, thank you for the great presentation. I do have some questions here that we will get to, but if you have other questions or comments for Dan and his colleague, John, please be sure to put them in the chat and we'll get to them shortly. First thing I wanted to ask was, you mentioned, I think, 12 jurisdictions that were impacted by the flooding event. Was that accurate?
I'd say, well, really, it's the whole county, but 12 jurisdictions have come together underneath that Joint Water Management Agency board. But there are other communities within Dodge County, and really this was a regional situation that impacted a lot of Nebraska, but 12 in particular make up that Joint Water Management Agency board.
Yeah, and as we saw in the questions that we were peeking at before we came to this Q&A piece, is there a champion to lead that joint board to keep the momentum going?
Sure. Yeah, and as the question noted, that in stormwater and flooding, it's always tough to keep that momentum going after a few years, and you certainly saw that momentum fade a little bit with respect to some of the non-structural opportunities that we felt existed. However, I just have to give credit to the local folks there. I really think that all 12 of those have at least one champion, if not multiple champions. Especially, I'll say, I even hate to say especially, because each of them are really contributing. I will say that the county is kind of taking the lead as kind of the arch, so to speak, of some of these things. And in particular, the emergency manager has been extremely proactive, aggressive, and successful in pushing for some of these grant opportunities and making stuff happen. And so I can't say enough about the attitudes and the actions that these folks are taking post-flood.
Great to hear. Another question for you. Will non-flood related planning, such as improving recreation or restoring habitat, be integrated into this resiliency plan?
It's certainly part of it. There's actually some talk out there to integrate some wetlands. This particular area is historically, it's low, it's next to the river. It does experience standing water. And so there are opportunities to integrate environmental benefits within the process. I'd say, generally speaking, I think the focus is definitely on flood risk reduction. However, if environmental benefits can be integrated into it, they will be.
Great. And one last question for you. Interesting one I'd love to see an answer to. Do you have an estimate of loss avoidance Fremont experienced during the March 2019 flood event due to previous flood risk reduction activities?
Well, I'll take a stab at it, John, if you want to think about it, but I do not know off the top of my head. There have been a number of actions taken in the past, with respect to this historic mitigations that I was speaking to, and then just some of the built-in both permanent features as well as some of the actions that were taken during the flood fighting. What I didn't really hit on was that some of those features were actually made more robust in a flood fighting effort, sandbagging and the like. And so I don't have a solid answer for you on that, but I do know that really just looking at some of the floodplain maps and what could have happened had those things failed or not been implemented, it could have been a lot worse.
I think that's a pretty good place as any to end. I want to thank everybody that presented today, between Dan and John on this last session, to Bill Smith earlier, and then Dell, who started us off. Really interesting topic. I appreciate the work every single one of you is doing, both from the audience and our presentation panel, to build more resilient communities. I think it's a great way to end our first sessions of ASFPM. Look forward to more tomorrow. Thanks for your time, everyone.